It happened many years ago, yet it still lingers in my mind as vividly as if it happened just yesterday. That night was supposed to be ordinary, a routine evening spent running errands. Little did I know it would turn into one of the most unsettling and inexplicable experiences of my life. I had started my errands with a clear plan: visit 3 stores and head home. It wasn't particularly late, but by the time I pulled into the parking lot of Dollar Tree, the sun had set, and darkness enveloped the world outside. The parking lot was sparsely populated, with only a handful of cars scattered across the asphalt. The store itself, illuminated by its bright fluorescent lights, seemed like a safe haven. Its familiar green and white signage beckoned me inside, a comforting symbol of convenience and simplicity. The moment I stepped in, the air was filled with the faint hum of the overhead lights and the quiet shuffling of other shoppers. The atmosphere was unremarkable, just the usual cluttered aisles stocked with affordable household items, snacks, and holiday decorations that seemed perpetually out of season. I grabbed a small basket and began weaving through the aisles, scanning the shelves for the items on my mental list. There wasn't anything unusual at first, just the routine humdrum of shopping. But then, I turned into one of the back middle aisles, and everything changed. Standing at the far end of the aisle was a man. He wasn't shopping, nor was he examining anything on the shelves. Instead, he was standing completely still, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on me. I paused, my hand hovering over a shelf of cleaning supplies as I tried to process what I was seeing. There was something profoundly unsettling about him. He wasn't doing anything overtly threatening, yet his presence sent a ripple of unease coursing through me. He was tall and wiry, dressed in plain clothes that didn't stand out: jeans, a dark hoodie, and sneakers. His face was pale and expressionless, devoid of any discernible emotion. It wasn't just the way he looked at me, it was the intensity of it. His eyes seemed to bore into me, unblinking and unnervingly focused. I didn't recognize him, nor did I feel any sense of familiarity. My mind scrambled to find an explanation. Perhaps he thought he knew me. Maybe he was lost in thought and looking through me rather than at me. I told myself to shake it off. People stare sometimes. It doesn't mean anything. Trying to ignore him, I turned my attention back to the shelves and picked up a few items, placing them into my basket with deliberate movements. When I glanced back down the aisle, he was still there, standing perfectly still, watching me. The logical part of my brain urged me to dismiss it, but a primal instinct deep within me told me something was wrong. Deciding I'd had enough of that aisle, I moved on. I wandered through a few more aisles, keeping an eye out for him, but he didn't follow me, or so I thought. I finished my shopping as quickly as possible, checked out, and left the store. By the time I stepped back into the chilly night air, I had mostly convinced myself that the encounter was just an odd, isolated moment. Maybe the man was socially awkward or having a bad day. Whatever the case, it was over now. Or so I thought. My next stop was a grocery store not far from Dollar Tree. It was the last store on my list for the night, and I was eager to finish my errands and head home. The store was much larger and busier, with rows upon rows of brightly lit aisles and the occasional hum of overhead announcements. Surely, I thought, the bustling atmosphere here would be enough to dispel the lingering unease I felt from the Dollar Tree. I grabbed a cart and began shopping, weaving through the aisles and focusing on my list. The rhythm of normalcy returned as I picked out produce, bread, and other staples. The crowd of shoppers around me felt reassuring, and for a while, I managed to push the strange encounter out of my mind. But then, about 20 minutes into my shopping trip, it happened again. I turned into an aisle, and there he was. At the end of the aisle, standing in the same rigid posture as before, was the man from Dollar Tree. My blood ran cold. He wasn't browsing, holding a basket, or doing anything remotely normal. He was just standing there, staring at me. The realization hit me like a freight train. This wasn't a coincidence. He had followed me. My breath quickened as my heart pounded in my chest. The store suddenly felt far less safe. My rational mind fought to come up with explanations. Maybe he just happened to shop at both stores. Maybe I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew this wasn't random. The odds were too slim, the circumstances too strange. I didn't linger in the aisle. Without a second glance, I turned my cart around and left. My hands gripped the handle of the cart tightly as I moved through the store, hyper-aware of my surroundings. My mind raced with questions. Why was he following me? What did he want? Had I done something to draw his attention? For the next several minutes, I scanned every aisle I entered, my eyes darting from one end to the other. But he was nowhere to be seen. It was as if he had vanished. Part of me hoped he had left, while another part feared he was simply waiting for the right moment to reappear. I tried to focus on finishing my shopping, grabbing the last few items on my list as quickly as possible. Finally, I made my way to the checkout. The cashier greeted me with a friendly smile, but I could barely muster a response. My senses were on high alert, every fiber of my being focused on the possibility that he might be nearby. Once I paid and bagged my items, I hurried out of the store, scanning the parking lot as I stepped outside. The night was colder now, the air biting against my skin. The lot was quieter than before, with fewer cars and fewer people. I made my way to my car, parked in the middle of the lot, but toward the back. As I approached, I glanced around and froze. Across the way, parked just a few rows away, was a car. Sitting in the driver's seat was the man. He was watching me again. This time, there was no doubt in my mind. He had followed me from Dollar Tree to the grocery store, and now he was waiting for me in the parking lot. My heart pounded in my chest as adrenaline surged through my veins. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of there, but I was paralyzed by fear. What if he followed me home? What if he was dangerous? I climbed into my car and locked the doors, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. Through the windshield, I could see him sitting there, motionless, his gaze never wavering. Minutes ticked by as I sat in my car, trying to decide what to do. I didn't want to drive off and risk him tailing me, but I couldn't just sit there forever. Finally, I decided to make a bold move. I stepped out of my car and walked back toward the store. My heart was pounding in my ears as I glanced back, expecting him to get out of his car and follow me. But he didn't move. Once inside the store, I wandered aimlessly for a few minutes, trying to calm my nerves and come up with a plan. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to check if he was still there. I walked back outside, my eyes scanning the lot as I approached my car. To my immense relief, his car was gone. He had finally left. Even now, years later, the memory of that night haunts me. Who was he? Why was he following me? What would have happened if I hadn't gone back into the store? I'll never know the answers, but one thing is certain. I'll never forget the chilling intensity of his stare and the suffocating feeling of being followed by someone who seemed to have no reason at all. My uncle owned a local dollar store for many years, and because of that, I ended up working there on and off during my high school and college years. The store wasn't large, but I knew every inch of it like the back of my hand. It was a comforting place most of the time, and I'd often work the evening shifts alone, especially on slower nights. One night, I was scheduled to close the store. We closed at 9 p.m., but by 8 p.m., the place was dead quiet. Not a single customer had come in for at least an hour, and the store felt empty and still, save for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. I sat behind the counter at the register, casually scrolling through my phone to pass the time. It was one of those nights where everything seemed routine, until it wasn't. From my perch at the counter, I had a clear view of the small parking lot outside. That's when I noticed two men walking through it. They were dressed in dark clothing, both wearing caps pulled low over their faces. Something about them caught my attention right away. Maybe it was the way they moved, deliberate but unhurried, or maybe it was the fact that they were the first people I'd seen in ages. Either way, I watched them as they approached the entrance. The men entered the store, and my stomach tightened. There was something off about them, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Without browsing or hesitating, they walked straight up to me at the register, The closer they got, the clearer it became that these weren't your average late-night shoppers. Their expressions were blank, but intense. Their body language stiff. One of them spoke first. "We're here to inspect the store," he said, his tone flat and businesslike. "Sent by the city." Immediately, alarms went off in my head. Inspectors? At 8 p.m.? On an unannounced visit? It didn't add up. If there was some kind of inspection scheduled, I would have been informed, or at least my uncle would have. Plus, these guys didn't look the part. They weren't wearing anything that remotely resembled a uniform or even a city badge. They looked more like two guys who just stepped out of a dark alley. Trying to stay calm, I replied, "I wasn't expecting anyone. Who exactly sent you?" The man didn't flinch. "The city," he repeated curtly. Then, almost as if rehearsed, he added, "We're just here a day or two early. That's why you didn't get a heads up." His explanation felt flimsy at best. My unease deepened as I scanned their faces, searching for any sign of sincerity. There was none. Everything about them screamed that they were lying, but I wasn't sure what they were up to. Were they trying to scam me? Case the store? Something worse? "I'm sorry," I said firmly, "but I can't let you do anything unless I get confirmation from my uncle or the city. You'll have to come back during regular hours if this is legit." Without another word, the men turned and walked away, not out of the store, but toward the back aisles. I watched them go, feeling a knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. They weren't leaving, and I had no idea what they were planning. My voice wavered slightly as I called out, "Where are you going?" But they didn't respond. They disappeared into the store's far end, where the shelves blocked my view. My pulse quickened. I was alone, and now there were two strange men somewhere in the store, out of sight. I knew I needed help, so I grabbed my phone and called my uncle. Thankfully, he picked up on the first ring. I explained the situation as quickly and calmly as I could, though I'm sure he could hear the tension in my voice. "That sounds really sketchy," he said. "We're not due for any inspections, especially not at night. You should ask them to leave, and if they don't, call the police." His words gave me a sense of direction, but they didn't do much to calm my nerves. As soon as I hung up, I looked around the store trying to spot the men. The aisles were silent and empty, the atmosphere unnervingly still. I waited for a moment, hoping they'd come back toward the front so I could confront them. But they didn't. After a few minutes, I decided I couldn't just sit there. I needed to take action. Leaving the safety of my counter, I cautiously walked toward the back of the store, my footsteps echoing on the tile floor. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting unsettling shadows. When I reached the back aisles, my heart sank. They were empty. The men were nowhere to be seen. For a moment, I stood there, frozen, trying to figure out where they could have gone. That's when it hit me. The back room. The store's back room was small and cluttered, used mainly for storing extra inventory and supplies. It wasn't a place where customers, or anyone unauthorized, should be. The door was clearly marked with a bold "Employees Only" sign, but if the men were trying to hide, it would be the most logical place for them to go. My stomach churned as I approached the door. It was closed, but I could feel the weight of something ominous on the other side. With a shaky hand, I opened it, revealing a dark, cluttered space. The room was eerily quiet, the air heavy with the faint smell of cardboard and cleaning supplies. I squinted into the shadows, my eyes darting from one stack of boxes to another. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Are you back here?" Silence. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to stay put. The thought of stepping further into that room sent shivers down my spine. What if they were hiding back there, waiting for me? I didn't want to find out. Swallowing hard, I backed out of the room and closed the door. My heart was racing as I hurried back to the front of the store, my steps quick and deliberate. Once I was back at my register, I dialed 911. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, who assured me that an officer would be there within minutes. Now, all I could do was wait, and hope that nothing happened in the meantime. The minutes stretched on endlessly. The store was deathly quiet, each creak and rustle amplified tenfold in the oppressive silence. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. It was as if the men had vanished into thin air. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. Finally, flashing red and blue lights lit up the parking lot. Relief washed over me as two police officers entered the store. I quickly explained what had happened, and they immediately headed to the back room. I stood by the front, watching nervously as they disappeared into the darkened space. A few tense moments later, they emerged. The men weren't there. The officers explained that there was a back exit in the storage room that led to an alley behind the building. It appeared the men had used it to slip away before the police arrived. When I went into the back room with the officers, I noticed the mess they had left behind. Several items were missing. Small but valuable things like tools and electronics that we kept stored in boxes. Some of the shelves were knocked over, and the already cluttered space looked even more chaotic than usual. I was shaken, but grateful. Grateful that I hadn't followed them into that back room. Grateful that I had trusted my instincts and called for help. And above all, grateful that I was safe. To this day, I still think about that night. Who were those men? What would have happened if I had gone into the back room? I'll never know, but one thing is certain. I learned to always trust my gut and never let my guard down. A few months ago, something happened to me that I'll never forget. Even now, just thinking about it gives me chills. It was a regular evening, nothing out of the ordinary. I was at home, winding down from a long day, when I suddenly remembered that I needed to pick up a few items from the store. Nothing urgent, just a handful of things I'd forgotten earlier. Since the closest store to me was a Family Dollar, and I knew it stayed open late, I decided to make a quick trip. It was around 9:15 p.m. when I grabbed my keys and headed out. The night was calm and quiet. The cool air brushed against my face as I walked to my car, and the world around me felt unusually still. I remember looking up at the sky, noting how dark it was. No stars, just an endless stretch of blackness. The streetlights in my neighborhood buzzed faintly, their orange glow flickering slightly, adding to the eerie atmosphere. The drive to the Family Dollar was uneventful. The streets were mostly deserted with only a few cars passing by. The area was quiet, almost unnervingly so. As I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed only 3 or 4 cars scattered around. The lot was dimly lit by overhead lamps, some of which were either too faint or not working at all. Shadows seemed to stretch across the asphalt, creating pockets of darkness between the parked vehicles. I parked near the entrance under one of the functioning lights and headed inside. The automatic doors slid open with a faint hiss, and the fluorescent lights inside the store flickered slightly before steadying. The store was practically empty, save for a lone cashier at the front and maybe one other customer who quickly exited as I entered. I grabbed a basket and began making my way down the aisles. Shopping was quick and easy. I knew exactly what I needed: some cleaning supplies, snacks, and a couple of other essentials. As I moved through the aisles, I couldn't shake the sense of quiet that seemed to hang in the air. Normally, there's at least some background noise in a store like this: the hum of conversation, the rustling of packaging, maybe a cart squeaking across the floor. But tonight, it felt different. The silence was almost oppressive, like the store itself was holding its breath. I didn't linger. I found everything I needed in about 10 minutes, then made my way to the front to check out. The cashier, a young woman who looked barely out of high school, rang up my items quickly. I paid, thanked her, and stepped back out into the night. That's when things started to feel truly off. As I walked toward my car, I immediately noticed something strange. A car was parked directly next to mine. At first glance, this didn't seem too odd, until I realized that there were plenty of open spaces in the lot, including several closer to the store entrance. Why would someone park so close to me when there were more convenient spots available? The thought lingered in my mind, a small but nagging unease beginning to creep in. The car next to mine was still running, Its headlights were on, casting a harsh glow onto the pavement in front of it. I couldn't see much through the tinted windows, but I could make out the faint silhouette of someone sitting in the driver's seat. My unease deepened as I approached my car, my footsteps slowing instinctively. Something about the situation felt wrong. I had almost reached my car when the door of the other vehicle suddenly swung open. The sound was sharp and jarring in the stillness of the night. My heart skipped a beat as a man stepped out of the car. He moved quickly, shutting the door behind him with a loud thud and walking around the vehicle to intercept me. He was tall, with a wiry frame and an unsettling demeanor. He wore a dark hoodie that obscured part of his face, but I could still make out his sharp features. His movements were deliberate and almost too calm, like he had rehearsed this moment. A chill ran down my spine as he stepped in front of me, blocking my path to my car. "Give me your keys," he said, his voice low and controlled. For a moment I was frozen. The words hung in the air between us, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. The way he spoke wasn't frantic or rushed. It was cold, calculated, and full of quiet menace. My eyes darted to his hands, looking for a weapon, but they were empty. At least that's how they appeared. I tried to steady my voice as I responded. "Why do you need my keys?" He didn't answer my question. Instead, he took a small step closer and repeated himself, this time with a little more force. "Just give me the keys." My mind was racing. I knew this wasn't just about stealing my car. There was something about the way he was looking at me, the way he had waited for me, that made my stomach churn with fear. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get away from him. Then, without thinking, I turned and ran. I bolted across the parking lot, my heart pounding in my chest as I heard his footsteps thundering behind me. He was chasing me. I didn't look back. Instead, I ran toward the Family Dollar, hoping to find safety inside. But as I neared the entrance, I realized he was too close. If I went inside, he might follow me, and I didn't want to risk getting cornered. Instead, I veered to the side of the building and kept running. Behind the store was an alleyway that led to a neighborhood. I sprinted down the alley, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. The man was still behind me, his heavy breathing growing louder as he closed the distance. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning with the effort. The alley opened up to a residential street, and I didn't hesitate. I ran into someone's front yard, darting around trees and bushes, desperately trying to put as much distance between myself and the man as possible. The neighborhood was quiet, and most of the houses were dark. I felt exposed, like every shadow could be hiding another threat. I cut through the backyard of one house, then another, weaving through fences and gardens. My lungs were on fire, and every breath felt like a struggle, but I didn't stop. Somewhere along the way, I realized I could no longer hear his footsteps. I slowed down, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Looking around, I saw a large bush near the edge of a yard and crouched behind it, trying to catch my breath. My heart was racing so fast that I thought it might burst out of my chest. Peering through the leaves, I scanned the area for any sign of him. The street was empty, the houses dark and silent. Had I lost him? Or was he hiding, waiting for me to come out? I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, every sound making me jump. The rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, even my own breathing seemed deafening. My phone was in my pocket, and with trembling hands I pulled it out and dialed 911. The dispatcher answered quickly, and I whispered into the phone, explaining what had happened. My voice was shaky, and I had to repeat myself a few times before they understood me. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way and told me to stay where I was. I waited there, hidden behind the bush, until I saw the red and blue lights of a police car approaching. Only then did I feel a small sense of relief. I stepped out from my hiding spot and waved them down, my body still trembling. The officers were kind but serious. They listened to my story and searched the area, but the man and his car were gone. When we returned to the Family Dollar parking lot, my car was still there, untouched. The officers escorted me to it, making sure I was safe before I drove home. That night I locked every door and window in my house, double-checking them at least 3 times before I finally went to bed. But even then I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard his voice demanding my keys, felt the terror of being chased through the dark. I haven't been back to that Family Dollar since. Even now, months later, the memory of that night haunts me. It's a constant reminder of how quickly a normal evening can turn into a nightmare, and how important it is to trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Working at Dollar Tree was never supposed to be eventful. It was a job, a simple one. For a little over a year, I clocked in, helped customers, stocked shelves, and closed the store at night. Most shifts were uneventful. The regulars came and went, familiar faces blended with strangers, and I passed the time with small talk and the monotony of retail. Compared to my previous retail job at a bigger chain store, this was a breath of fresh air. The pace was slower, and the stakes were lower. I wasn't bombarded by endless streams of customers or stressed out by demanding managers. I thought I'd finally found a position where I could relax. That's probably why what happened during one particular week rattled me so much. It wasn't just out of the ordinary, it was downright terrifying. It all started on a regular weekday evening. I was on the night shift and scheduled to close the store by myself. One of my co-workers had stayed with me until an hour before closing, but then they left, leaving me alone. This wasn't unusual. I'd closed by myself plenty of times before. The store rarely saw much foot traffic during the final hour. Around 7:30 p.m., a man walked in. I noticed him immediately, not because he was doing anything strange, but because he seemed so ordinary. He was of average height, had short hair, and wore plain clothes. Nothing distinctive. He didn't make small talk as he picked out a single item and brought it to the register. "Good evening," I said, ringing up his purchase. He gave me a curt nod but didn't say anything. Within moments, he paid and walked out. I didn't think much of it until he returned less than 30 minutes later. This time, I recognized him right away. He was unmistakable, not because of any particular feature, but because it was rare for someone to shop twice in one night. I assumed he must have forgotten something during his first trip. He wandered the aisles for a bit before coming back to the register with another single item. "Find everything okay?" I asked, trying to be polite. He just nodded again, his expression unreadable. There was no friendly banter, no excuse for his return, just silence. He paid and left as quickly as before. I shrugged it off as odd, but harmless. Maybe he lived nearby and liked shopping in small bursts. Retail exposes you to all kinds of personalities, and I'd learned not to overanalyze. Still, his silence lingered in my mind. When he returned a third time that night, my unease deepened. It was around 9 p.m., nearing closing time, when he walked in again. I watched as he strolled down the aisles, seemingly aimless this time. The store was completely empty except for him and me. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, and the quiet felt oppressive. He eventually brought another insignificant item to the register. I rang it up without a word, my chest tightening as I handed him his receipt. He lingered for a moment after paying, his eyes scanning the store before he finally left. I locked the doors as soon as the clock struck closing time. I was relieved the night was over and ready to go home. After finishing my final tasks, I stepped outside into the chilly night air. The parking lot was dimly lit, and the silence felt unnatural. That's when I saw him again. He was standing in the grassy area that separated our parking lot from the neighboring business. My car was parked nearby, the only vehicle left in the lot. My stomach knotted as I realized he hadn't left after all. He wasn't shopping. He was waiting. I tried to stay calm as I walked to my car. My keys were clutched tightly in my hand, the jagged edges digging into my palm. "Hey!" he called out as I neared my car. I ignored him, but my pace quickened. "Can you give me a ride?" he asked, his voice flat and emotionless. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. I turned to face him, keeping my distance. "Sorry," I said firmly. "I can't." He didn't argue, but he didn't leave either. He just stood there, watching me as I unlocked my car and climbed inside. My hands trembled as I started the engine, and I could feel his eyes on me as I pulled out of the lot. The whole drive home, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see his car following me. I didn't sleep well that night. A few nights later, I was back on the same shift. The store was quiet again, and I was mentally preparing for another solo closing. Around 8:30 p.m., just half an hour before closing, the man walked in again. My stomach sank. This time, he seemed more purposeful. He didn't wander the aisles like before. Instead, he grabbed something quickly and came straight to the register. As I rang up his purchase, I couldn't stop myself from wondering what he wanted. Why did he keep coming back? Why me? He left without a word, but my unease didn't fade. At 9 p.m., as I locked the doors, I glanced outside nervously. The parking lot was empty. I breathed a small sigh of relief and went about my final tasks. Just as I was finishing up, I saw movement outside. He was back. He stood at the locked doors, peering inside. When he saw me, he knocked on the glass. "We're closed," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can I just grab something real quick?" he asked. "Sorry, no, we're closed," I repeated, my heart racing. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at me through the glass. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. I waited until I was sure he was gone before leaving the store. My car was the only one in the lot, and the thought of being alone out there made my skin crawl. I practically sprinted to my car, locking the doors as soon as I got inside. A few nights later, I was at a friend's house. We were hanging out, catching up, and the TV was on in the background. I wasn't paying much attention to it until a news story caught my ear. A man had been arrested for robbing a store in a nearby town. My heart skipped a beat as they showed his mugshot on the screen. It was him. The same man who had lingered at Dollar Tree, asked me for a ride, and knocked on the doors after closing. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized how close I'd come to being his next target. Had he been planning to rob the store? Or worse? I told my friend everything, my voice trembling as I recounted the encounters. She was horrified, and so was I. Looking back, I'm grateful I trusted my instincts and kept my distance. I don't know what would have happened if I'd let him back into the store that night, or if I'd given him a ride. That week left me shaken in a way I'll never forget. Even now, when I think about it, I can still feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting. Some nights, I wonder what might have happened if I hadn't been so careful. And that's a question I hope I'll never have to answer. It was a bright, sunny Saturday morning, and everything about the day promised a relaxing, peaceful weekend. I decided to make the most of the pleasant weather and walk to my local dollar store to pick up some snacks. It was only a short stroll, just a few blocks from my house, and the fresh air felt invigorating. The sun was shining, the sidewalks were warm, and I could hear birds chirping faintly in the distance. When I arrived at the store, the atmosphere was calm. A few other customers meandered through the aisles, idly browsing like I was. I enjoyed mornings like this, quiet, unhurried, with no stress or obligations. After a few minutes of wandering the shelves, I started collecting my favorite snacks, a bag of chips, some candy, and a drink or two. Just as I was about to grab another item, something strange happened. A woman, someone I'd never seen before, walked up to me as if we were old acquaintances. Her approach was deliberate, and her presence caught me off guard. "Excuse me," she said, her voice polite but with a strange undertone. "Do you have a spare room, or somewhere I could stay?" I froze, confused. My mind raced to process the odd request. Who was this woman? Why was she asking me, a complete stranger at a dollar store, if I had space for her to stay? No, I replied, shaking my head. "I don't." She seemed undeterred. "I just moved into town and my apartment lease doesn't start for a couple of days," she explained, her tone calm and almost too casual for the situation. Her explanation caught me off guard even more. This wasn't some desperate, disheveled person pleading for help. She looked ordinary, put together even. Still, the randomness of it all unnerved me. I hesitated, then cautiously suggested, "Maybe you could stay at a hotel for a couple of nights?" She sighed, shaking her head. "Hotels are too expensive. I'm known to save money." I didn't know what to say. This whole interaction felt surreal, like something you'd hear in a weird story but never experience yourself. She didn't look threatening, but something about her demeanor made me uneasy. There was a slight edge to her tone, a persistence that put me on high alert. "I'm sorry," I said firmly. "I can't help you." She looked disappointed but didn't press the issue further. With a small shrug, she muttered something under her breath and walked away. I watched her wander off into another aisle, feeling a strange tension settle in my chest. I decided I'd had enough shopping for the day. I quickly grabbed the last item I needed, paid for everything at the register, and left the store. The walk back to my house should have been as uneventful as the walk there, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling the encounter had left me with. The woman's request played over and over in my mind. Why had she approached me? Was she asking everyone? Or had she singled me out? The sunny weather felt less inviting now, the warmth on my skin doing little to dispel the creeping chill in my chest. I glanced behind me once or twice, half expecting to see her following me, but the streets were empty except for the occasional passerby. I reached my house, eager to put the strange incident behind me. Unlocking the door, I stepped inside, tossed my bag of snacks on the counter and turned on the TV. Grabbing a cold drink, I sank into my couch, ready to enjoy the quiet of my living room. Then came the knock at the door. It wasn't a loud or urgent knock, just a soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap. For a moment, I assumed it was a delivery person or a neighbor stopping by for something. I wasn't expecting anyone, but the knock didn't immediately alarm me. I walked to the door, ready to answer, but at the last second, a nagging feeling made me pause. Instead of swinging it open, I peered through the peephole. What I saw made my heart drop. It was her, the woman from the dollar store. She was standing on my front step, her expression calm, but her presence unnerving. My mind raced as I tried to piece together what was happening. How did she find me? Had she followed me home? I didn't open the door. Instead, I stood there, frozen, watching her through the peephole. She knocked again, louder this time. "Hello?" she called out, her voice muffled but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. I stayed silent, hoping she'd think I wasn't home and leave. But she didn't. She knocked again, this time for nearly a full minute, the sound echoing through the house. "I know you're in there," she called, her tone sharper now. "I saw you come in." My chest tightened as fear began to set in. This wasn't normal. This wasn't okay. She tried the doorknob next, jiggling it forcefully. Thankfully, I'd locked it when I came in, but the sound of her trying to get in sent a wave of panic through me. I backed away from the door, unsure of what to do. Should I confront her? Call someone? What did she want? When she finally stopped trying the door, I thought maybe she'd given up. But then I heard movement, footsteps heading around the side of the house. My stomach sank as I realized she was heading for the backyard. Moments later, the knocking resumed, this time on the back door. I felt trapped. She was relentless, circling my house like a predator. "Let me in!" she yelled, her voice more aggressive now. "I just need a place to stay." I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. I tried to explain the situation to the dispatcher, my voice trembling with fear. "There's a woman at my house," I said. "She followed me home from the dollar store and she's trying to get in." The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way. Meanwhile, the knocking continued. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. I peeked out the front window and saw two police officers getting out of their vehicle. The woman was still there, pacing in my front yard. When she saw the officers, she immediately began talking to them, pointing at my house and gesturing wildly. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but when I opened the door to speak to the officers, her words became clear. "He kicked me out!" she shouted, her voice laced with anger. "This is my house and he locked me out!" I stared at her in disbelief. "She doesn't live here," I told the officers, my voice firm but shaken. "I've never met her before today." The officers looked between us, clearly trying to piece together what was going on. I quickly showed them my ID and some mail with my name and address on it to prove that I lived there. The woman's story unraveled quickly under their scrutiny. Eventually, the officers escorted her away, warning her not to come back. As they left, one of them assured me that they'd keep an eye on the area for a while, just in case. When the door finally closed behind me, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was short-lived. The thought of how far she'd gone to follow me and fabricate a story about living in my house left me deeply unsettled. Even now, I don't know what her intentions were or why she targeted me. Was she desperate, dangerous, or something else entirely? All I know is that I'll never forget the sound of her knocking, relentless, demanding, and haunting. That sunny Saturday morning turned into one of the strangest, most terrifying experiences of my life.